Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're taking a slow, sleepy stroll through the world of ancient Rome, the land of togas, triumphs, and, well, truly terrible ways to make a point. So, go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket and let your mind drift somewhere between a marble forum and a warm bathhouse. We're not here to rush. We're here to quietly explore how one of history's most powerful civilizations managed to turn punishment into both a moral statement and occasionally a public spectacle that made even their gods raise an eyebrow. And yes, this is the Romans we're talking about. The same people who built aqueducts that still stand today, created concrete that outlived empires, and yet somehow thought being sewn into a sack with a snake and a dog was a perfectly reasonable way to say bad citizen. Because, of course they did. Let's start at the very beginning. When Rome was still just a collection of ambitious huts perched on 7 hills. Law and order back then were, let's say, personal. If someone wronged you, you didn't exactly call the authorities. You called your cousins, grabbed a stick and hoped for the best. But as Rome expanded, it discovered the wonders of bureaucracy, and with it came written laws. The famous 12 tables, around the 5th century BCE, were Rome's first attempt at fairness. They were carved into bronze and displayed in public, so no one could pretend they didn't know the rules. And to their credit, some of the laws were sensible. Things about contracts, property, and not throwing your neighbour's body into their own yard. But the punishments? They were where Rome's creativity really shined. If you were a thief, your options ranged from being flogged to being thrown off a cliff. If you were a dishonest debtor, you could literally be cut into pieces and divided among your creditors. A practice that sounds made up but isn't, because apparently that was justice. And people say credit card debt is bad today. As the Republic grew, so did the imagination of Roman lawmakers. They believed deeply in the idea of deterrence, meaning punishment should not only hurt, but also be seen to hurt. So, public execution wasn't just accepted, it was expected. It was part of the civic experience. You'd go to the forum to buy bread, chat about politics, and maybe catch a crucifixion before lunch. And let's pause on that word, crucifixion. The Romans didn't invent it, but they definitely perfected it. It was a punishment reserved for slaves, rebels, and foreigners. Basically anyone who didn't have the privilege of Roman citizenship. That detail mattered a lot, because if you were a Roman citizen, you had rights, even in death. You could be beheaded quickly and cleanly. If you weren't, well, good luck. Crucifixion was deliberately slow. It wasn't meant to kill you instantly, but to make you hang there, sometimes for days as a warning. There's no record of anyone ever surviving it. Even the threat of it was enough to keep entire provinces quiet. And as grim as that is, Romans saw it less as cruelty and more as order. A public reminder that Rome was watching, that the empire's peace was maintained not by kindness but by consequence. But crucifixion wasn't the only show in town. Let's float towards something even stranger, like the punishment of parricide. In Roman culture, family was sacred. Killing your father, mother, or close relative was the ultimate crime. One that disrupted not just society, but the cosmos itself. So Rome came up with something special. It was called poena culae, literally, the punishment of the sack. If you were found guilty, you'd be sewn into a large leather bag with a collection of unhappy animals. Typically a dog, a snake, a monkey and a rooster, and then thrown into a river. Now, we don't know if the exact combination of animals was always used, or if the Romans just picked whatever was lying around that day. But the symbolism was clear: chaos. The animals represented disorder and madness, and the sack meant you were being cut off from the world of the living. It was theatrical justice, part moral allegory, part public nightmare. To modern eyes it seems excessive, maybe even cartoonish, but to Romans it was deeply spiritual. They believed crimes like parricide offended not only human law but the gods themselves, so the punishment had to be cosmic, balance had to be restored, preferably in front of a crowd. And speaking of crowds, the Romans didn't just stop at punishment, they turned it into entertainment. By the time the empire rolled around, especially under emperors like Augustus and Nero, public executions became part of the daily rhythm of urban life. The Colosseum, for example, wasn't only about gladiators. Sometimes, between matches, criminals were brought in for quick, dramatic justice. They called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. It was exactly what it sounds like. Criminals, prisoners of war, or unlucky slaves were sent into the arena unarmed, facing lions, bears, or even exotic animals brought from across the empire. The crowds cheered, the emperor watched, and somewhere in the middle of it all, someone took notes to use it as a moral example. It wasn't always lions, though. Sometimes, criminals were dressed up in mythological costumes, like poor Icarus or Hercules, and their performance would end in a very real, very fatal finale, because apparently even death could use a little theatre. Now, before you picture all Romans as sadists, it's worth noting, punishment wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was purely social. Being exiled was considered one of the worst things that could happen to a Roman elite. Losing your home, your reputation, and your connection to the Senate was essentially a slow erasure from public life. In a culture obsessed with legacy, that was worse than death. An exile wasn't random. The Romans had degrees of it: relegatio, deportatio, and interdictio. Each one decided how far away you went, what you could keep, and whether you might ever come back. Senators and poets often got the soft version, while enemies of the state, not so much. Take Ovid, for example, the poet who gave us Metamorphoses. He was exiled by Augustus to the edge of the Black Sea for what he vaguely called a poem and a mistake. He spent the rest of his life begging to come home, which he never did. Apparently, writing a little too cheekily about love and imperial morality was enough to ruin your career, and that, honestly, feels timeless. Punishment in ancient Rome wasn't random cruelty. It was theatre, religion, and social order rolled into one. Every penalty had a moral message. Every execution was a lesson, and every crowd knew exactly what they were watching. The machinery of empire doing what it did best, keeping everyone in line. Of course, it's easy to judge now. We have human rights, legal appeals, and social media cancel culture instead. Different tools, same instinct. We still crave visible justice. We still want to see wrongdoing met with consequence. We just prefer it in comment sections now instead of the Colosseum. Let's pause here for a moment. You can take a slow breath. Feel how strange it is, how both alien and familiar these old Roman ideas of punishment sound, because even across thousands of years, human behavior doesn't really change. Only the methods do. When you're ready, let's drift forward to see how the emperors themselves handled justice. Spoiler: not very well. Part 2. A Roman Day at the Office. Executions, bureaucracy, and a bit of theatre. So, picture this. You're living in ancient Rome. The streets smell like olive oil, sweat, and the faint aroma of wet marble baking in the sun. And somewhere nearby, a man in a toga is shouting at a slave for not polishing his sandals properly. It's just another day in the empire, except for the fact that someone's about to be executed in the local amphitheatre. See, in Rome, punishments weren't always about justice. They were about performance, and nobody knew how to put on a show quite like the Romans. They treated execution as public entertainment, a social event. Citizens gathered in the arena not just to see justice served, but to have lunch, gossip, and cheer while someone was, well, dramatically unalived in the most imaginative way possible. Let's start small. If you were a regular Roman citizen, not a slave, not a foreigner, just your average toga-wearing taxpayer, you had rights. The famous Roman citizenship meant that you couldn't just be crucified or tortured without a proper trial. In theory, at least. But if you weren't so lucky, say, you were a slave or an enemy of the state, things got a lot messier. Let's talk about crucifixion. Yeah. The Romans didn't invent it, but they perfected it like it was a fine wine. They used crucifixion for slaves, rebels, and anyone they really wanted to make a point with. The idea wasn't just to kill, it was to humiliate. Slowly, publicly, and preferably painfully. The victim was usually flogged first, because apparently why stop at one layer of agony? Then they were forced to carry their own crossbeam through the streets to the site of execution. It was a kind of death parade, a warning to anyone watching that maybe rebellion wasn't such a great idea after all. Once there, the condemned would be tied or nailed to the wood, sometimes in strange poses, just to make it more creative. Death came slowly, over hours or even days, from suffocation, exhaustion, or exposure. Romans didn't do subtlety. Crucifixion was so dreaded that Roman citizens were generally exempt from it, unless, of course, you managed to anger the emperor himself. In that case, the rules didn't really apply anymore. But let's float over to another punishment, one that sounds like something out of a fever dream. The poena culi, or, in plain English, the punishment of the sack. This was reserved for the crime of parricide, killing your father, which, in Roman society, was basically the worst thing imaginable. Here's what they did. They'd tie the guilty person's hands, cover their head with a wolfskin hood, and then put them in a leather sack with a few guests, specifically a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster. Yes, really. Then they'd sew the sack shut and throw the whole thing into a river. The symbolism was poetic in a horrifying way. Each animal represented chaos and betrayal, and being sealed up with them was like being erased from the natural order itself. You weren't just being executed, you were being deleted. Of course, gathering all those animals must have been quite the logistical nightmare. So sometimes the Romans just improvised. A couple of snakes here, a stray dog there. Good enough. Bureaucracy at its finest. Speaking of bureaucracy, let's talk about one of Rome's quieter punishments, damnatio memoriae. This one wasn't physical. At least, not directly. If you seriously offended the state, the Senate could pass a decree to erase your existence from history. Your name would be chiseled off monuments, your statues would be defaced, your records destroyed. Imagine someone just hitting backspace on your entire life. The goal wasn't just to punish you, it was to pretend you'd never existed. Of course, it rarely worked completely. Humans are stubborn creatures and gossip is eternal. Take Emperor Domitian, for example. After his death, the Senate declared damnatio memoriae on him. They smashed his statues, scrubbed his name from inscriptions, and yet we still remember him today. Which kind of defeats the whole purpose, doesn't it? Let's move over to something a bit more inventive. Romans loved spectacle. They believed that the grandeur of punishment reflected the grandeur of the empire. So when it came to executions in the arena, creativity went wild. Some criminals were forced to reenact myths, except they didn't exactly get to act the deaths. They really died. One particularly grim favourite was the story of Orpheus, the musician torn apart by wild animals. In the Roman version, a condemned man dressed as Orpheus would play a lyre in the arena, and then right on cue, lions would be released to complete the myth. Another involved Icarus, except instead of flying too close to the sun, the unfortunate soul was launched off a mechanical contraption meant to imitate flight, and then fell to his death. The crowd loved it. It was like theatre, punishment, and dinner all rolled into one. But not all Roman punishments were bloody. Some were just boring, and yet psychologically brutal. Take exile, for example. Being sent away from Rome wasn't always a tropical vacation. It was social death. You'd lose your citizenship, your property, and your network. You could end up on some lonely island, living out your days writing poetry to pass the time. Which, come to think of it, is exactly what the poet Ovid did. He got exiled by Emperor Augustus for what was officially called a poem and a mistake. Nobody knows exactly what that mistake was, but knowing Roman court politics, it was probably something as petty as flirting with the wrong person or overhearing the wrong rumour. Ovid spent the rest of his life in Tomis, modern-day Romania, which, according to his letters, was cold, miserable, and full of barbarians who didn't appreciate literature. His punishment wasn't about physical suffering. It was about isolation, humiliation, and endless regret. In a way, it's the most Roman punishment of all, clean, efficient, and psychologically devastating. And yet, for all this obsession with order and discipline, ancient Rome could be oddly inconsistent. Sometimes punishments were carried out in grand arenas with orchestras and fanfare. Other times, they were handled quietly, a knife in the back, a quiet poisoning, or a mysterious illness that conveniently solved a political problem. Because at the end of the day, Rome was built on two things: power and performance. Justice was just, the decoration on top. Let's drift to the darker side of that, the world of slaves and the law. In Rome, slaves were property, not people, and that meant punishment could be extreme. If a master was murdered, for example, all the slaves in his household could be executed, even if they had nothing to do with it. There's a recorded case from the reign of Nero where a senator was killed by one of his slaves. The Roman Senate ordered the execution of all 400 of his slaves. The public protested, saying it was unfair, which, honestly, it was. But the Senate stuck to it. The law was the law. That's the thing about Rome. They prided themselves on civilization, on order, on reason. But beneath all that marble and philosophy was a society perfectly comfortable with cruelty, as long as it kept the machinery running smoothly. And maybe that's the most fascinating contradiction of all. Rome gave us art, architecture, law, and literature. But it also gave us some of the most disturbingly creative punishments in history. There's something strangely human about that mix, brilliance and brutality coexisting in the same empire. So as you drift towards sleep, Maybe it's worth remembering every empire, no matter how grand, has a dark corner full of cages, sacks, and half-forgotten laws written in fading ink. And the Romans, they just happened to make those corners spectacular. Part 3. The Emperor's Playground. When justice became personal. Hey again. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've survived the first couple of centuries of Roman punishment history. But things are about to get even more imperial. Because once the emperors showed up, justice stopped being a system and started being a personality contest. Let's be clear, the Romans had laws, lots of them, shelves full of scrolls and entire professions dedicated to debating what counted as reasonable punishment. But all that went out the window when the emperor decided that your face annoyed him. Justice, in the imperial age, was basically step 1, make the emperor mad. Step 2, suffer creatively. Let's take a slow, relaxing stroll through some examples. First stop, Emperor Tiberius, the man who came after Augustus, the one who looked permanently tired of humanity. Tiberius was smart, cynical, and, to put it kindly, a little paranoid. He spent much of his reign convinced that everyone was plotting against him, and since paranoia and power make a terrible cocktail, he started executing senators just to stay on the safe side. It began with polite trials, accusations of treason, false testimony, confiscated estates, but soon trials weren't even necessary. A whisper, a letter, a rumor, that was enough. People learned not to speak the emperor's name in public, not to joke about him, not even to sneeze near a statue of him. He eventually retreated to the island of Capri, where he surrounded himself with astrologers, flatterers, and an unfortunate number of distractions. From there, he ruled Rome by proxy, sending letters ordering deaths like he was managing a very grim postal service. Punishment under Tiberius wasn't about justice. It was about fear, and the fear worked. Then came Caligula. Ah yes, Gaius Caesar, known to his friends as that guy who definitely lost it. Caligula started off popular. The army loved him. The people adored him. But power and adoration are like Roman wine. Strong, intoxicating, and dangerous in large doses. Soon, Caligula began treating the empire like his personal stage. When someone annoyed him, he didn't just execute them. He made a point of enjoying it. He supposedly said, "Let them hate so long as they fear," which honestly could have been the slogan for half of Rome's rulers. He's famous for having senators run beside his chariot like pets. And when he got bored of one, well, accidents happened. He also loved ordering executions at dinner parties. Casually, like someone asking for more wine. Guests had to pretend to enjoy the meal while someone screamed in the courtyard. It's said that when one man begged for mercy, Caligula replied, "Why? You'll be dead soon anyway." It's dark humor, Roman style. Of course, a ruler like that doesn't last long. Caligula was eventually assassinated, ironically by his own guards, who were probably just tired of waiting to be next. Now, float with me to a calmer kind of madness. Claudius. He wasn't cruel by nature, more awkward and easily manipulated. Claudius had a limp, a stammer, and a family that treated him like an embarrassment. When his nephew Caligula died, people were shocked to find Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, only to be declared emperor. For a while, things went pretty well. He reformed the courts, improved laws, and even extended citizenship to provinces. But there's a pattern with Roman emperors. give them enough power and enough poisonous relatives. And eventually, things get weird. Claudius's wives were ambitious, especially Messalina and Agrippina. Both used accusations and executions like chess pieces. If someone stood in their way, the charge of treason appeared like magic. By the end of his reign, Claudius had signed so many death warrants he probably stopped reading them. He eventually died, likely poisoned by Agrippina, who then put her son Nero on the throne. So yeah, justice was a family business, and then came Nero. The man, the myth, the disaster. Nero is one of those emperors who's become more legend than history. A name that instantly conjures fire, music, and total chaos. He wasn't always terrible. When he started, people liked him. He was young, charming, artistic. He lowered taxes, banned secret trials, and gave slaves the right to complain about their masters. For a brief moment, it looked like Rome might actually become a little less terrifying. Then he got bored. He wanted to act, sing, perform, basically to be the world's first celebrity emperor. The Senate hated it, the army mocked it, but the people, they kind of loved it. And then came the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Half the city burned, thousands were displaced, and rumours spread that Nero had been playing music while watching it all go up in flames. To deflect blame, he needed a scapegoat. Enter the Christians. They were a small, unpopular group at the time, easy to target. Nero blamed them for the fire, and the punishments he invented, for them were theatrical even by Roman standards. Some were burned alive as human torches in his gardens. Others were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. It was public entertainment, wrapped in the language of justice. And Nero, of course, watched from a safe distance, probably critiquing the lighting. Eventually, everyone turned against him. The Senate declared him a public enemy, and he fled the city. His final act, suicide, or as he put it, what an artist dies in me. Classic Nero. But Rome didn't stop there. Over the next few centuries, emperors came and went, each with their own style of justice. Some, like Vespasian, were practical. He taxed everything, even public toilets. Yes, even that was a Roman invention. When his son mocked the idea, Vespasian held up a coin and said, "Money doesn't smell," a slogan for capitalism centuries ahead of its time. Others, like Domitian, returned to paranoia and purges. He had informants everywhere, punished jokes, and executed philosophers for being too opinionated. Because nothing says confidence like killing people for disagreeing with you. And through it all, one thing stayed the same: the performance. Every trial, every sentence, every execution had an audience. Justice wasn't blind in Rome. It wore a toga, stood on a marble stage, and made sure everyone was watching. Even after the Republic faded and emperors ruled with absolute power, Romans still wanted the illusion that punishment was orderly, that every death had meaning. They built monuments, wrote decrees, and performed legal ceremonies that made even the cruelest acts sound civilized. It's kind of beautiful, in a deeply unsettling way, because at the heart of it, Rome wasn't just punishing people. It was reinforcing a story that the empire was eternal, disciplined, and divinely justified. If a few thousand people had to be crucified, burned, or erased from memory to prove that point, well, so be it. As the centuries rolled on, Roman punishment softened a bit, at least on paper. Torture was still around, but it became more bureaucratic, reserved for slaves and traitors. Executions became more standardized, less theatrical, but by then, the idea of punishment as spectacle was already part of Rome's cultural DNA, and when the empire fell, that legacy didn't vanish. It just moved into medieval Europe, the Inquisition, the public hangings of London, and even into modern-day fascination with true crime. So really, when we watch stories of scandal and downfall today, we're just continuing Rome's favorite pastime. All right, take a breath. We've wandered through marble corridors, crossed the blood-soaked sands of the arena, and survived a few deranged emperors, but the story's not over yet. In the next part, we'll drift through the quieter punishments, exile, disgrace, and the slow, suffocating weight of shame in the Roman world. Because sometimes, the worst punishment wasn't death, it was simply being forgotten. Part 4. The soft punishments. Shame, banishment, and the long goodbye, welcome back. If you're still with me, congratulations. You've survived the emperor's whims, public executions, and the occasional human torch. Now, let's slow things down a bit and explore the quieter side of Roman justice. Because not every punishment involved lions, sacks, or dramatic deaths. Sometimes the Romans wielded something subtler, yet equally effective: social erasure. Let's start with exile, which was arguably the most dreaded punishment for Roman elites. Being exiled meant leaving Rome. No more Senate meetings, no more family dinners, no more baths in the hot springs or gossip in the forum. You could be sent to an island, a distant province, or somewhere conveniently inconvenient. Take Ovid, the poet we mentioned before. He was sent to Tomis, modern-day Constanza on the Black Sea. Imagine the cold, windy beaches, the endless forested hills, and the barbarian neighbours who didn't care about Latin poetry at all. Ovid's crime. According to Augustus, a poem and a mistake. The poem was probably his Ars Amatoria, which taught Roman citizens how to seduce people, a little too frank for imperial taste. The mistake might have been, well, who knows? Historians suspect some court intrigue or romantic entanglement. Either way, his exile lasted decades. Letters survive where he begs to return. Every line drips with quiet despair, longing for a city he could never touch again. It's interesting. Exile didn't kill you, but it slowly eroded your identity. You were still alive, but absent from the world that mattered. In Roman society, absence could be worse than death. Then there was infamia, a kind of social death. Infamia stripped people of legal rights, dignity, and public standing. It applied to actors, prostitutes, gladiators, and anyone who embarrassed the state in some way. A person marked with infamia could no longer testify in court, hold office, or marry freely. The punishment was subtle, almost invisible, but it stung deeply. Because Romans cared about reputation, losing face meant losing influence, wealth, and purpose. It was a slow, quiet agony, inflicted without a blade or beast. Another favourite tool of the Romans was confiscation of property. If you fell out of favour with the emperor, the Senate, or your family, the state could seize your land, your home, and your money. This was devastating in a society where wealth was power and land was identity. A man without land was a man without standing, without honour, without voice. And because Roman law was intricate, confiscation often came with a twist. It could be given to someone else. A political rival might end up with your villa, your slaves, and your vineyards. It was punishment and incentive rolled into one, a subtle reminder that your empire could be stolen while you were still alive. Now, let's drift over to public shame. Romans loved to punish with ridicule. If you offended the law but didn't deserve death, the state could humiliate you instead. One method was forcing the guilty to wear a symbolic sign, perhaps a placard describing the crime. They'd walk through the streets while citizens gawked, laughed or shook their heads. It was early social media, Roman style. Word got around fast. For some, this was worse than dying, because public shame could follow you forever. Your family could be tainted. Your descendants' marriages could be affected. The ripple effect was psychological, subtle, long-lasting, and deeply Roman. Even emperors used shame as a weapon. Take Domitian, for example. He executed senators, yes, but he also delighted in mocking them publicly before their deaths. He'd read their letters aloud, highlight their mistakes, and reduce them to caricatures. Death was inevitable, but the performance of shame amplified the punishment. This is a recurring theme in Roman justice. It wasn't just about law, it was about story. Every punishment, whether subtle or gruesome, communicated a narrative, the state's omnipotence, the emperor's will, and the consequences of stepping out of line. Even minor offences could carry heavy social consequences. Take the case of curfew violations or minor thefts. In early Rome, someone caught stealing might not be executed, but they could be publicly beaten or paraded with their crime announced to the community. It was a warning. Step out of bounds, and everyone will know. Think of it like modern name and shame campaigns. Except you couldn't scroll away or close the tab. The audience was always present, and humiliation was inescapable. And then there was debt punishment, an issue so mundane it almost feels modern. If you failed to pay debts, Rome had a variety of solutions. In the early Republic, debtors could be enslaved by creditors. Later, laws softened slightly, but financial failure still carried social consequences. Sometimes you lost property, sometimes freedom. Other times, your reputation was stained, leaving you dependent on the mercy of patrons. Debt in Rome wasn't just numbers on a tablet, it was shame, exclusion, and social death. A man who owed money could find himself barred from the forum, losing friendships, marriages, and influence. Even exile, infamia, confiscation, and public shame could blend together. Imagine a senator accused of plotting against the emperor. First, he's stripped of his rank and titles, infamia. Next, his property is seized and given to rivals. Then, he's sent to a distant province, exile. Finally, his name is erased from inscriptions, the ultimate silent. Punishment. Death isn't always required when the machinery of social and psychological punishment works this thoroughly. The Romans understood human psychology in a way that's quietly brilliant. They knew fear alone wasn't enough. Spectacle wasn't always necessary. Sometimes the quiet, creeping punishments, shame, exile, confiscation, were more effective than crucifixion or damnatio ad bestias. And for those of us drifting to sleep while thinking about it, there's a certain elegance to that. The Romans weren't just about cruelty, they were about control, order, and narrative. Every punishment told a story about who had power and who didn't. Even today, we still see echoes of that. Reputation matters. Social ostracization matters. Psychological impact often outlasts physical pain. The Romans, in their calm, bureaucratic and slightly theatrical way, figured that out centuries ago. So as we settle in, let's quietly reflect. Punishment in ancient Rome wasn't always about blades, beasts or dramatic deaths. Sometimes it was a long, slow erosion of identity, standing and memory. Sometimes it was exile to a far-off land where the sea and wind became your only companions. Sometimes it was a public whisper, a carved erasure, a carefully arranged confiscation, and in every case, it reminded people, the observers, the citizens, the guilty, and even the emperor himself, that Rome was eternal, omnipresent, and remarkably creative. Next time, we'll wander back into the bloodier arenas and explore the most unusual punishments that somehow survived as Roman law and legend went from live burial to the weird world of slaves and imperial eccentricities. Part 5. The strangest and most inventive Roman punishments. Welcome back. By now, you're familiar with the extremes of Roman justice. Crucifixions, poena culae, public executions, and the subtle art of exile and shame. But Rome, in its infinite creativity, had an entire toolbox of punishments that were, well, let's say unusually imaginative. Tonight, we'll float gently through some of the most bizarre, theatrical, and quietly clever ways the Romans dealt with lawbreakers. Nothing here is life or death exciting, just historical curiosity wrapped in calm monotony. Let's begin with the curse tablets, known as defictiones. These were small lead sheets inscribed with curses, and sometimes buried under crossroads, thrown into wells, or nailed to temple walls. The idea, rather than physically harming someone, you'd ask the gods to do the dirty work. Imagine a Roman shopkeeper upset with a rival who undercut prices. He might write, "May this person stumble, lose their customers, and have their chickens die mysteriously." Then he'd bury the tablet and wait. It's almost quaint, a magical complaint department. The Romans believed these curses worked, and enough people left them around that archaeologists today have uncovered hundreds. Some are mundane. Make my neighbour's dog stop barking. Others are delightfully petty. May his left sandal be forever uncomfortable. These punishments were quiet, psychological, and, in a sense, socially safe. No public spectacle, no crowds, just a personal appeal to the divine, which for some was probably terrifying enough. Next, let's drift toward humiliation through costumes. Romans had a subtle love for satire and spectacle combined. Offenders could be forced to wear absurd clothing in public, announcing their crime through fashion. If you were a corrupt official, for example, you might be dressed as a donkey or a mythical fool. Citizens would laugh, gossip would spread, and your dignity would evaporate. This is fascinating because it blends punishment with theatre, with the crowd as participant. No blood, no pain, just slow, creeping embarrassment, and in Rome, that mattered. For an elite, reputation was everything. A toga of shame could ruin a senator more effectively than a flogging. Then there were inventive forms of labor punishment. For minor crimes, Romans might assign physically exhausting tasks, but always with a little flair. Slaves could be sent to quarries or mines. A thief might be forced to clean public toilets or repair roads while chanting his crime aloud. The purpose was dual: practical labor for the state and continuous social reminder of the offender's status. Even the physical labor itself became a form of narrative. You weren't just working, you were performing your guilt for anyone passing by. Some punishments were downright bizarre in execution. Take live burial, occasionally used for crimes like adultery or magic. The condemned would be placed in a pit, sometimes with a small amount of food, and left to die. It was quiet, ritualized, and symbolically powerful, being cut off from the world completely. And unlike the sack punishment, it didn't involve snakes or dogs, just solitude, earth, and inevitability. Romans loved this mixture of symbolism and practicality. Death wasn't just a consequence, it was a story. You were erased, folded into the soil, and made to symbolize the gravity of your crime. Now, the world of slaves offers some of the most peculiar punishments. Slaves were property, but Roman law occasionally acknowledged their ability to disrupt society. A misbehaving slave could be forced to fight wild animals, perform humiliating tasks, or be subjected to public ridicule. Punishment was almost always public, reinforcing the hierarchy and reminding everyone, including other slaves, of the consequences of disobedience. Some sources mention chains decorated with inscriptions, like wearable shaming devices. Imagine walking through the Forum, your crime engraved on metal around your neck. A simple, quiet, but enduring reminder that Rome was watching. Then there were poetic punishments, which probably appealed to the literary Romans. Offenders could be required to compose poems or public speeches confessing their crime, often in front of an audience. If they failed to amuse, the punishment could escalate. So crime and art became strangely intertwined. It was moral instruction wrapped in creativity, turning guilt into performance. Let's not forget the treadmill punishments. Though not exactly the gym kind we know today, some historians record devices where the guilty had to turn large wheels or grind grain endlessly. These machines were practical, but also deeply monotonous. They punished physically and mentally. The slow, repetitive motion mirrored the long, dull weight of guilt. There's a certain poetry in that, isn't there? Unlike crucifixion or poison, these punishments were subtle, almost meditative, if you squinted while ignoring the chains and exhaustion. Finally, the Romans loved punishments with irony. For instance, someone guilty of fraud or lying could be forced to act as a herald for public announcements. They would stand in the Forum proclaiming truths, while everyone knew they had been liars. It's almost performance art centuries before the concept existed. Or consider someone guilty of theft being forced to guard treasures in public. Every passerby would see the irony. The person who stole now protecting the very thing they once took. The Romans understood narrative justice. Punishment wasn't always about suffering. It was about story, memory, and symbolism. Even when the method was mundane, it carried a message. The state is wise, omnipotent, and quietly creative, and that, in a sleepy, contemplative way, is the beauty of Roman punishments. From the theatrical to the mundane, from exile to symbolic labor, Rome demonstrated that law could be both practical and performative. Every penalty told a story. Every action reinforced order. Every citizen, slave, and emperor understood. Punishment wasn't just consequence. It was communication. So as we drift, let's reflect. Cruelty, cleverness, and theatre coexisted in Rome like wine, water, and olive oil. Nothing was wasted. Every act had meaning. Every punishment had purpose. And in that quiet, calm way, it reminds us how deeply human the Romans were. Brilliant, creative, and sometimes terrifyingly imaginative. Part 6. Divine Wrath and Ritual. When religion and punishment collided, welcome back. By now, you've seen Roman punishments range from theatrical executions to the quiet cruelty of exile and shame. But there's another layer, one that blends the spiritual with the judicial, the intersection of religion and punishment. In Rome, gods were everywhere, in temples, in homes, in public spaces, even whispering in the Senate, probably giving advice no one asked for. And if the gods were involved, crimes could be punished with ritual, superstition, and symbolic acts that made the ordinary observer pause. Let's start with sacrificial punishment, though not always literal blood sacrifices. Romans believed that misdeeds could anger the gods, destabilizing society. So for certain crimes, murder, theft from temples, sacrilege, the state sometimes performed rituals of purification, where the guilty party had to undergo a process that was partly spiritual, partly humiliating, and partly public spectacle. A classic example is the purification of households after murder. If someone killed a family member, priests might enter the house, sprinkle consecrated water, and perform rites to cleanse the space, and by extension, cleanse the family. The guilty party might be forced to participate in prayers, wear ritual garments, or even make offerings. It wasn't death. It wasn't particularly fun, but it was psychologically potent. The idea, gods were watching, the community was watching, and you couldn't hide. Then there were religious oaths as punishment. Romans took oaths seriously. Swearing falsely wasn't just lying to people, it was lying to the gods themselves. For example, if someone committed perjury or cheated in court, they might be forced to swear an oath in front of a temple, holding a sacred object, perhaps a branch of olive or a symbol of the deity, promising never to repeat the crime. The penalty for breaking that oath? Social disgrace, legal action, or divine vengeance. Imagine the tension. One false word could anger Jupiter, bring disaster on your family, and guarantee lifelong shame. Even for petty crimes, this kind of punishment had weight. Romans didn't need theatrics. The gods' potential wrath was enough. Let's float over to another form of ritual punishment. Tabooed exile. Sometimes, criminals were sent to religiously significant locations as part of their banishment. Certain islands, sacred groves, or riverbanks were chosen because they were under divine protection. Being removed from Rome wasn't just about isolation, it was symbolic. You were physically removed from society and spiritually marked. The punishment communicated, your crime has angered both state and gods. It was the long goodbye, a punishment of distance, silence, and divine attention. Then there's poena sacra, or sacred punishment, particularly for violations against temples, priests, or religious rituals. Sacred law was considered more binding than civil law. Steal a sacred statue, kill a priest, desecrate an altar? Your punishment might include fines, ritual restitution, or forced labor dedicated to the temple. Sometimes, the punishment involved performing sacred duties in public. Imagine being guilty of temple theft and then having to sweep the altar every day, chanting prayers of apology, a blend of public humiliation and religious obligation. Slow, symbolic, and constant divination and punishment also played a quiet but powerful role. Romans often consulted augurs and haruspices before trials, executions, and political decisions. The interpretation of omens could determine guilt or innocence, or even the method of punishment. For example, If the entrails of a sacrificial animal indicated divine displeasure with a particular method, a magistrate might change the sentence. The god's will was considered binding. Humans could argue, but in the end, divine interpretation often decided the outcome. So punishment was a dance between human law and divine mandate. It wasn't just practical or theatrical, it was cosmically meaningful. Let's drift to a quieter, subtler method: religious shame. Crimes against the gods often carried social repercussions beyond formal punishment. If someone failed to honor a festival, neglected prayers, or spoke disrespectfully of a deity, the community might ostracize them. Neighbors might refuse to do business, friends might avoid them, and whispers would spread. It's the same principle as infamia, but layered with spiritual consequence. The idea: you weren't just offending the community, you were offending cosmic order itself. And yes, sometimes religion and theater overlapped. Public rituals could become punishing performances. A criminal might be paraded before a temple during a festival, forced to confess, wear ritual garments, or carry symbolic objects denoting guilt. The audience? Citizens, priests, magistrates. The goal? Reinforce law, reaffirm divine order, and remind everyone watching of the consequences of misdeeds. Even emperors participated. Take Caligula, for example. He famously ordered religious ceremonies that humiliated political rivals. A senator might be forced to stand in the temple of Jupiter, reciting prayers of contrition, while Caligula and the crowd observed. It was public, spiritual, and subtly terrifying. Death wasn't necessary. Shame, divine attention, and performance were enough. Finally, the Romans had symbolic executions tied to religion. Some criminals were executed at crossroads or near sacred sites. The symbolism, being removed from society, exposed to divine forces, and placed at the intersection of the human and spiritual worlds. Sometimes the method of death carried religious meaning. For example, drowning in the Tiber or being buried on sacred ground served both as punishment and ritual offering. The act was legal, psychological, and spiritual, a complete package. So, as you drift slowly into the calm world of ancient Rome, consider this. Punishment wasn't just a tool of the state. It was a narrative, civil, social, and divine. Every exile, every oath, every ritual acted as a reminder that Rome existed in layers: human law, social expectation, and divine order. And sometimes the quiet, ritualistic punishments were more enduring than the spectacular bloody ones. Because shame, exile, and divine attention lingered. They touched the mind, the heart, and even the soul. Part 7: The Curious Lives of Roman Criminals, Petty Thieves, Senators, and Social Theatre. Welcome back. By now, we've wandered through brutal spectacles, quiet shames, and divine judgments. But what was life actually like for someone on the receiving end of Roman justice? Let's float gently into that world. From minor offenders to senators on thin ice, and observe the daily realities of punishment. First, let's linger on petty thieves. These weren't grand conspirators or rebellious slaves. They were people stealing bread, coins, or a neighbor's chicken, the everyday miscreants of Rome. The punishment? Often practical, sometimes humiliating. A thief might be flogged in public. Citizens would gather. The magistrate would read the crime aloud, and the offender would endure a measured whipping. The purpose wasn't just pain, it was visibility. Everyone saw what happens to those who break the rules. Sometimes, the punishment involved loss of hand or finger, depending on the crime. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty, it was a lasting reminder. A missing digit or scar told the community, "I've erred, and now I bear the mark forever." And after punishment, life continued. Thieves weren't executed for minor thefts. They returned to society, often impoverished, sometimes stigmatized. It's a slow, subtle form of control. Less spectacle, more quiet social reinforcement. Now, float toward the lives of indebted citizens. Debt was a huge part of Roman life. Failing to repay loans could land a person in a peculiar middle ground between slavery and free status. Some debtors were bound to their creditors, performing labor until the debt was repaid. Others were publicly shamed or ostracized until settlements were made. Interestingly, even wealthy citizens weren't immune. If a senator defaulted on obligations, the law could strip titles or property. The psychological weight of social disgrace often carried more impact than financial loss alone. Debt, punishment, and reputation intertwined in ways that affected everyday life. Then there were corrupt officials. Corruption was rampant in Rome. Unsurprisingly, a public official caught embezzling or abusing power might be forced to pay restitution, but sometimes the punishment was more theatrical. They might stand in the forum, announcing their crime and paying fines under public observation. The humiliation served as a lesson to others and reinforced the emperor's or magistrates' authority. Even senators weren't immune to ritualistic punishments. Take someone accused of treason or plotting against the emperor. They might be exiled, have property confiscated, and watch as their family's status diminishes. Punishment wasn't always immediate death. It was gradual, public, and layered with psychological impact. Now, let's drift towards slaves and how punishment shaped their daily routines. Slaves formed the backbone of Roman society, and discipline was strict. Punishments could range from floggings to more unusual methods, like forced public labor, symbolic chains, or performing humiliating tasks before free citizens. Even minor disobedience could result in extended labor or social embarrassment. Interestingly, some forms of punishment reinforced loyalty, or at least compliance. A well-timed flogging or public shaming reminded the slave of their place. It was brutal, yes, but designed to maintain order in households, markets, and public spaces. Let's float over to senators caught in political intrigue. Unlike petty criminals or slaves, senators experienced a mix of ceremonial, social, and psychological punishment. One common method was damnatio memoriae, or condemnation of memory. Names were erased from inscriptions, statues destroyed, and records edited to remove them from history. This is fascinating because death wasn't always required. Erasure of identity could be more chilling than execution. You were alive, but forgotten, a ghost in your own city. Some senators were forced into exile, sometimes to distant provinces. Life there could be quiet, almost peaceful, but the social and political ramifications were severe. You'd be removed from influence, your voice silenced, your ambitions thwarted. The combination of exile, property loss, and public shame made daily life a constant reminder of your failure. Even emperors used punishments as spectacle for public morality. If a senator or citizen violated laws, emperors might organize ceremonies emphasizing repentance, restitution, or humiliation. A public ritual could involve kneeling, symbolic gestures, or reading confessions aloud. The purpose was dual: educate the citizenry and remind the elite that status alone didn't guarantee immunity. Now, for the curious intersection of punishment and daily life, consider the concept of continuous monitoring. Romans believed that surveillance reinforced moral order. Offenders could be watched by magistrates, neighbors, or slaves tasked with reporting behavior. Even small missteps might be noted and reported. For criminals, this created a life dominated by caution, ritual, and social anxiety. Every action had weight. Every gesture could attract attention. And let's not forget the psychological punishment of anticipation. Sometimes, the waiting period before exile, flogging, or execution was deliberately extended. This slow build-up created tension, fear, and reflection, a punishment in itself. The Romans understood human nature. They recognized that the mind could suffer as much as the body, and many punishments were designed to exploit that quiet suffering. Finally, we can't ignore the legacy of punishment in daily life. Even after sentences were served, the mark remained, a scar, a ruined reputation, or a family in disgrace shaped interactions, marriages, business, and politics. Romans lived in a society where history and memory mattered as much as law. Your crime might be minor, but its consequences could ripple for decades, and that ripple effect quietly enforced order long after the magistrate or emperor had moved on. So, as we drift gently, we see that Roman punishment wasn't merely about immediate consequence. It shaped daily life, social hierarchy, and psychological reality. From petty thieves to senators, every offender existed in a web of observation, ritual, and consequence, and while the more dramatic punishments get all the attention, the quiet, persistent forms, exile, shame, labor, surveillance, often left the deepest imprint. Part 8. Life Behind Bars. Roman Prisons and the Punishment of Time. Welcome back. So far, we've seen Roman punishments that were public, theatrical, subtle, and ritualistic. Now, let's drift into a quieter, less dramatic, but equally compelling world, the lives of those confined in Roman prisons. Because in Rome, punishment wasn't always about the spectacle. Sometimes it was about waiting. Sometimes the slow, monotonous passage of time became the penalty. Roman prisons, known as carcer, were often small, damp, and rather uncomfortable, though less hellish than later medieval dungeons. They weren't meant for long-term incarceration, at least initially. Prison was more of a holding space while trials, executions, or exile decisions were pending. Think of them as the precursor to modern holding cells, grim, functional, and psychologically taxing. There were a few notable locations. The Mamertine prison in Rome is famous. Located near the Forum, it had a reputation for being a place where high-profile offenders awaited judgment. It was dark, cramped, and smelled strongly of human occupation. Hardly a spa retreat. Some prisoners were political figures, like conspirators against the state. Others were criminals, debtors, or those caught committing sacrilege. Life there was quiet, monotonous, and mostly uneventful, which in itself could be maddening. Daily life in a Roman prison revolved around minimal necessities. Prisoners were provided food, usually bread, water, and sometimes porridge. Shelter was basic: stone floors, walls to confine movement, and little warmth. Sanitation was poor. There were no baths or luxuries. It was designed to be dull and uncomfortable, a slow reminder of your misdeeds. In some cases, prisoners had companions, which could either ease loneliness or amplify misery depending on the personalities involved. Interestingly, Roman prisons were not always about isolation. Public visibility was a component. Sometimes, prisoners were paraded before magistrates, neighbors, or temple officials. Even in confinement, there was a psychological element. Others could see your status, your disgrace, and your dependence on the state. And for wealthy or noble prisoners, this could be particularly humiliating. A senator or equestrian accustomed to privilege, suddenly confined to a dank cell. The contrast alone was punishment enough. Chains and restraints were common but not always. Extreme iron shackles or fetters limited movement. Some prisoners were bound by wrists, ankles, or neck. The restrictions weren't lethal, but they reminded the confined constantly of their lack of freedom. Even walking a few steps required effort and thought, subtly reinforcing the weight of punishment. Now, let's float to the social dynamics inside prisons. Roman prisons contained people of all sorts: thieves, debtors, slaves, political enemies. Hierarchy persisted even here. Wealthier prisoners could bribe guards for better treatment. Poor prisoners endured the full monotony and discomfort. Time passed slowly, and boredom was a persistent companion. Reading and writing were rare privileges. Most of the day involved sitting, lying, or staring at walls. Psychologically, this was punishing. The mind, left idle, began to wander, often back to the crimes that brought them here. In many ways, the prison functioned as both a physical and mental punishment. Extended detention could be particularly harsh. Some prisoners waited months, even years, for trial or sentence. During this time, they experienced monotony, uncertainty, and social isolation. It's easy to imagine the slow erosion of hope, compounded by discomfort and occasional humiliation from guards or fellow inmates. For slaves and lower-class prisoners, labour could be added to confinement. Some were forced to work in quarries, roads, or public buildings as part of their sentence. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the state productive while simultaneously punishing the offender. The combination of physical toil and confinement created a layered form of discipline. Roman prisons also had a ceremonial aspect. High-profile prisoners might be displayed in public before sentencing, an eerie mix of suspense and social theatre. Even behind bars, punishment was partly about narrative, reminding the public that the state was just, omnipotent, and observant. The confined individual was both spectator and performer in this subtle drama. Psychological punishment was key. The uncertainty of release, the monotony of confinement, and the social visibility of one's disgrace created ongoing mental strain. Unlike public executions, which were immediate and dramatic, imprisonment was slow, grinding, and persistent. In many cases, that slow erosion of hope and dignity was more punishing than the more famous, gruesome methods. And there's a fascinating note: not all prisoners were treated the same. High-ranking citizens often had private cells, food allowances, and personal attendants, while common criminals endured the full harshness. Even within confinement, social hierarchy remained, subtly reinforcing the importance of status in Roman life. So as we drift along, we see that Roman prisons were more than holding spaces. They were instruments of quiet punishment. They enforced mental strain, social humiliation, and the passage of time as a penalty in itself. The mind became the arena, monotony became the weapon, and walls became the subtle instruments of justice. Even without spectacle, blood, or fire, the prison delivered its message. Crime, disobedience, and sacrilege carried consequences that touched every aspect of life, from freedom to dignity, to the slow ticking awareness of loss. Part 9. Punishments for Women and Children. Gender, Youth, and Subtle Discipline. Welcome back. So far, we've explored Roman punishments from public executions to quiet exile, ritualistic cleansing, and the slow erosion of identity in prison. Tonight, let's drift toward a quieter, often overlooked area. How women and children experienced justice in ancient Rome. Because in Rome, punishment was never one size fits all. Gender and age shaped the methods, meaning, and symbolism of every sentence. Let's begin with women. Roman women were considered citizens but lacked full political power. As such, punishments often focused less on public spectacle and more on social control, moral instruction, and family honor. Adultery, for example, was treated very differently depending on gender. A man committing adultery might face fines or social ridicule. A woman? She could face divorce, confiscation of dowry, exile, or ritualistic humiliation. One notorious law, the Lex Julia de Adulteris, enacted by Augustus, criminalized adultery with strict penalties for women. Punishments included loss of property, restriction from certain social activities, or banishment to remote estates. The aim was often symbolic, controlling morality, reinforcing patriarchal norms, and sending a message to the family and community. Women could also be punished for religious transgressions if a Vestal virgin broke her vow of chastity, a crime considered sacrilegious. She faced a particularly quiet and chilling method, live burial. Unlike the dramatic public executions of men, this punishment emphasized solemnity, ritual, and moral teaching. The act wasn't designed to entertain the public. It was a ritualized statement about purity, divine order, and societal expectations. Even minor offenses could carry heavy social consequences. A woman caught lying, gossiping, or failing in familial duty might be ostracized, denied inheritance, or publicly shamed through symbolic acts, such as being removed from ceremonies or forced to attend with modest garments marking her disgrace. In this way, punishment for women often worked quietly, subtly, and persistently. Now, let's float over to children. Roman children, particularly those of elites, experienced a mixture of discipline, shame, and expectation. In wealthy households, punishment often took the form of parental correction, corporal punishment, temporary deprivation of privileges, or public reprimand. For example, a boy failing in education or etiquette might face a mild flogging or be required to stand in public during lessons or gatherings as a cautionary display. Children in poorer households often faced harsher realities. Minor thefts, neglect of labor duties, or misbehavior could result in beatings, forced labor, or temporary servitude. Punishment aimed to teach obedience and survival skills rather than moral philosophy alone. Interestingly, family honor was central to youth punishment. Roman society placed heavy emphasis on ancestry, reputation, and social standing. A child's misbehavior could reflect poorly on the entire family. As a result, punishments often extended to public embarrassment, ritualized admonishment, social exclusion, or required participation in moral instruction. Even schooling could serve as punishment. Children might be forced to memorize moral texts, recite lessons publicly, or perform repetitive tasks designed to instill discipline and shame for misdeeds. Gender and age influenced not just the type of punishment, but also its symbolic meaning. For women, the message was often about purity, morality, and family honor. For children, the focus was obedience, social education, and preparation for adulthood. In both cases, punishment blended psychology, social norms, and subtle performance. Let's drift toward ritualized punishments for elite girls. If a young girl of high status broke societal expectations, for instance, flirting too openly, disobeying parental guidance, or failing in ritual duties, she might be subjected to formal lectures, public admonition, or temporary exclusion from social events. It sounds mild compared to other Roman punishments, but for someone whose identity was tightly bound to family prestige and social expectation, it could be profoundly disorienting. Even for boys, moral education was a form of punishment. Failing in school, public speaking, or social exercises could lead to repetition, humiliation, or corrective labor, blending discipline with psychological pressure. Symbolism remained key. Punishments for women and children rarely relied on spectacle or bloodshed. Instead, they focused on ritual, social standing, family perception, and psychological pressure. Every act communicated norms, obedience, moral conduct, and awareness of social consequences. Even exile for young elites or women had a dual purpose: removing the offender from the community, teaching a long-lasting lesson through absence, reflection, and social observation. Roman society also used marriage and family duties as tools of punishment. For girls and women, forced marriage could serve both political and punitive purposes. If a family fell out of favor, a daughter might be wed to a less desirable partner, symbolizing both loss of choice and family decline. The message to the community was subtle but clear. Missteps have repercussions, often extending across generations. Even children of criminals experience consequences. If a parent committed a crime, a child might face social ostracism, restricted opportunities, or temporary guardianship by the state. Justice in Rome was sometimes intergenerational, reflecting the importance of family reputation. So, as we drift quietly, the lesson is this: punishment in Rome was not uniform. Gender and age mattered profoundly. Women faced quiet, socially symbolic, or ritualized punishments emphasizing morality and family honor. Children faced structured, educational, and sometimes humiliating punishments designed to prepare them for society. In all cases, punishment was about control, narrative, and subtle reinforcement of societal norms. Next up in Part 10, we'll conclude our exploration by examining the lasting psychological and social effects of Roman punishments and how even after sentences were served, the shadows of shame, exile, and ritual lingered in everyday life. Part 10. Shadows of Punishment. Long-term effects on mind, society, and memory. Welcome back. Tonight, we drift toward the final stretch of our exploration into Roman punishments. We've wandered through public spectacles, ritualized judgments, prisons, and the unique experiences of women and children. Now, let's consider something quieter, subtler: the long-term psychological, social, and familial effects of punishment in Rome. Because punishment didn't always end with chains, exile, or ritual. In many ways, it lingered, shaping minds, reputations, and society itself. Let's start with shame and social memory. In Rome, a public crime wasn't just a momentary embarrassment. It became part of your social identity. A thief, adulterer, or corrupt official carried the memory of transgression long after the magistrate had moved on. Even after release, people remembered, neighbors whispered, friends judged, and the offender's family often bore indirect consequences. A single misdeed could ripple through daily life for years, affecting marriage prospects, business opportunities, and social standing. Damnatio memoriae, or erasure from memory, illustrates the power of psychological punishment. When the state condemned a person to oblivion, their statues were destroyed, inscriptions removed, and historical records altered. The individual might still be alive, but the social and historical erasure was a persistent shadow. Imagine existing while being simultaneously forgotten. No audience, no acknowledgement, just a slow disappearance from memory and recognition. It's chilling in its subtlety. A punishment for the mind, long after physical penalties had ceased. Prisons, as we discussed, functioned similarly. The monotony, isolation, and surveillance slowly eroded mental resilience. Even after release, former prisoners often carried anxiety, cautiousness, and social hesitance. The punishment wasn't over. It merely transitioned from external control to internalized vigilance. For women, the lingering effects of punishment often manifested as social. Restriction and moral expectation, public shaming or exile left a mark not only on the individual, but on the family. Marriage opportunities diminished. Dowries might be confiscated, and participation in ceremonies could be limited. Every interaction reminded the punished of past misdeeds, reinforcing compliance with societal norms. Children, too, felt long-term consequences. A child disciplined publicly or confined to rigorous moral instruction often carried the lessons into adulthood. Embarrassment, structured obedience, and ritualized correction shaped behavior, social awareness, and personal identity. The memory of punishment became part of the social conditioning that prepared them to navigate Roman society. Labor, punishments, and ritualized work left both physical and psychological traces. Endless days of grinding grain, cleaning streets, or performing humiliating public tasks created routine, reflection, and internalized control. The body remembered, and the mind associated effort and monotony with transgression. Even after the labor ended, the lessons lingered. Religious punishments also imposed long-term effects. A ritual cleansing, public prayer, or symbolic act of repentance communicated divine disapproval. The guilty person learned, consciously or unconsciously, to fear both societal judgment and spiritual consequence. This subtle psychological pressure reinforced the values and hierarchy of Rome across generations. Even elite criminals experienced lingering consequences. Exiled senators or disgraced magistrates faced loss of influence, property, and identity. Their families often suffered alongside them. Restoration of status was possible, but rarely immediate, and the psychological weight of shame lingered like a quiet, constant echo. An interesting aspect of Roman punishment is its integration with everyday life. Unlike fleeting executions or violent spectacles, many punishments were slow, quiet, and persistent. They worked by embedding consequence into the rhythm of existence. Daily labor reminded of guilt, rituals reminded of divine oversight. Public humiliation reinforced social norms. Family and community mirrored the consequences across relationships. The punishment extended beyond the individual, influencing households, neighborhoods, and the civic fabric itself. Even after death, memory mattered. Inscribed laws, monuments, and histories preserved examples of criminal behavior, punishment, and virtue. The living learned not just from their own mistakes, but from the recorded experiences of others. In this way, punishment became both temporal and eternal, shaping society long after the sentence had passed. And so, as you drift slowly toward the end of this exploration, consider this quiet truth. Roman punishment wasn't just about pain or spectacle. It was about shaping minds, enforcing norms, preserving social order, and intertwining law with morality and religion. Every flogging, exile, ritual, and labor assignment carried lessons. Every public humiliation, every prison day, every symbolic act embedded itself into the rhythm of life, creating a society in which behavior, memory, and expectation were tightly interwoven. Punishment in Rome was slow, subtle, and pervasive. It touched mind, body, and social standing. It shaped individuals quietly, persistently, and effectively. The long, monotonous weight of consequence quietly enforcing order. And with that, our journey into the world of Roman punishment comes to a gentle close. You can imagine the streets of Rome, the quiet prisons, the temples, and the forums, all filled with echoes of lessons learned, mistakes remembered, and consequences carried like invisible chains. Nothing dramatic, nothing spectacular, just the calm, unyielding structure of justice and order. Sleep well tonight, pondering the quiet power of time, memory, and social expectation, Roman style.